By December 1777, the revolution was hanging by a thread. The British had captured Philadelphia in September, forcing Congress to flee and occupying the capital where independence had been declared just 16 months earlier. Washington's attempts to defend the city had failed at Brandywine and Germantown, leaving Continental Army demoralized and British forces triumphant in symbolic heart of American rebellion. The loss of Philadelphia represented more than military defeat. It suggested that British strategy of capturing major cities and isolating resistance would eventually succeed in crushing rebellion that lacked resources to sustain prolonged conflict. American morale shattered as citizens questioned whether independence was achievable when Continental Army could not prevent British from taking any city they targeted with sufficient force. British occupation of Philadelphia gave them comfortable winter quarters in largest American city, while Washington's army faced prospect of freezing and starving through winter without adequate shelter or supplies. The contrast could not have been starker. British officers attended balls and theatre in occupied capital, while Continental soldiers wondered if they would survive until spring to continue fighting war that seemed increasingly hopeless. The army retreated not from battle but from brink of complete collapse, moving away from British-occupied Philadelphia to find winter quarters where they might survive, season that threatened to accomplish what British arms had not: total destruction of Continental Army through exposure, starvation, and desertion that would end revolution without need for further military campaigns. He led a ghost army into the wilderness. Washington's decision to winter at Valley Forge placed Continental Army 20 miles from British positions in Philadelphia, close enough to monitor enemy movements and prevent British raids into countryside, but far enough to avoid direct confrontation that army in its weakened state could not survive. The location seemed strategic, but conditions would prove nearly fatal to force already diminished by defeats and desertions. Men leaving bloody footprints in snow became enduring image of March to Valley Forge, representing physical suffering that accompanied every step, as soldiers lacking adequate shoes wrapped feet in rags that provided minimal protection against frozen ground. The visual testimony of their passage marked roads with blood from wounds that would not heal, and that made every mile of march agony for troops who had already endured months of campaigning without proper rest or supplies. The soldiers marched uncertain if they would live to see spring, understanding that winter at Valley Forge would test their endurance in ways that battlefield combat never had. Death from exposure and starvation seemed more likely than death from British muskets, making winter encampment potentially more dangerous than continued military operations, despite risks that combat always entailed. Washington led Ghost Army because so many of his soldiers were barely alive, their physical condition so deteriorated that they resembled spectres more than fighting men. The army that arrived at Valley Forge was shadow of force that had crossed Delaware a year earlier, depleted by casualties, disease, desertion, and expired enlistments that reduced Continental forces to bare minimum needed to maintain Army's existence as organized military entity. They built huts on frozen ground and prayed they'd last the night. Arrival at Valley Forge in mid-December 1777 meant soldiers faced immediate task of constructing shelter before winter cold killed them where they stood. The encampment took shape amid snow and freezing temperatures as exhausted men felled trees and assembled crude log huts that would house 12 soldiers, each in cramped conditions that provided minimal protection from elements. Construction proceeded slowly as weakened soldiers lacked tools and energy for efficient building, making process of creating even basic shelter take weeks while men slept in tents or open air waiting for huts to be completed. Officers shared soldiers' suffering, Washington himself refusing better quarters until his men were housed, demonstrating leadership through shared hardship that helped maintain discipline when circumstances tempted desertion. Mud and hunger shaped daily life as winter thaw turned camp into quagmire, where moving between huts meant wading through freezing slush that soaked through inadequate footwear and chilled soldiers already weakened by insufficient food. Disease spread rapidly in crowded, unsanitary conditions where 12 men shared small spaces without adequate ventilation or hygiene facilities that might have prevented contagion. The Camp of Misery earned its reputation as soldiers endured conditions that seemed designed to break human spirit and destroy army through attrition more effective than any British military campaign. Yet somehow, most stayed, bound by loyalty to cause and commander, even when reason suggested that desertion offered better chance of survival than remaining in frozen hell that Valley Forge had become. They fought no battles, only hunger, cold, and despair. Food shortages plagued Valley Forge from beginning, as corrupt supply systems and inadequate Continental Congress funding failed to provide even minimum rations necessary to sustain army through winter. Local farmers preferred selling to British in Philadelphia, who paid in gold, rather than to Continental Army whose paper currency was nearly worthless, leaving American soldiers to starve while enemy feasted 20 miles away. Soldiers boiled leather from their shoes and equipment when no other food was available, scavenged bark from trees to make soup that provided no nutrition but filled empty stomachs temporarily, and fainted from hunger during drills when officers attempted to maintain military discipline despite troops' physical incapacity to perform basic maneuvers. The desperation was complete as men faced choice between desertion that might save their lives and loyalty that might cost them everything. The breakdown of morale threatened army's survival more than physical privation, as soldiers questioned why they endured such suffering for cause that seemed unable to provide basic support necessary to sustain military resistance. Officers struggled to maintain order among troops who had legitimate grievances about treatment that seemed to demonstrate Continental Congress's indifference to army's welfare and survival. Hunger and desperation defined Valley Forge experience in ways that no description could fully capture, creating suffering that tested every soldier's commitment to independence and that revealed whether revolution possessed popular support deep enough to sustain military force through conditions that would have justified mutiny or mass desertion by any reasonable standard of human endurance. Every night, he wrote by candlelight and wondered if he had failed. Washington's letters from Valley Forge reveal torment of commander who bore responsibility for army's suffering while lacking power to remedy supply failures and political dysfunction that created crisis. His correspondence with Congress grew increasingly desperate as he begged for resources that legislators seemed unable or unwilling to provide, watching his army disintegrate while politicians debated and delayed action that might have prevented catastrophe. Washington's doubt emerged in private writings, where he questioned whether his leadership was adequate to challenges he faced, whether his strategic decisions had been correct, whether army could survive winter that he had led them into without ensuring adequate supplies and shelter. The burden of command weighed heavily on General who felt personally responsible for every soldier's suffering and death, understanding that his decisions directly affected whether army would exist in spring to continue resistance. His loyalty never wavered despite doubts about his abilities, maintaining commitment to independence cause and to soldiers who trusted him even when circumstances suggested that trust might be misplaced. The loneliness of command became crushing as Washington faced criticism from politicians and rival officers while trying to hold together army that was dissolving around him through no fault of his own but under his ultimate responsibility as commander. Leadership under collapse required Washington to project confidence he did not feel, to maintain discipline when he questioned his own decisions, to inspire troops whose suffering he shared but could not alleviate through will alone. His private torment contrasted with public stoicism that soldiers needed to see if army was to survive winter, that tested everyone's resolve and revealed whether revolution possessed leadership adequate to its extraordinary demands. Even as he starved, others plotted to replace him. The Conway cabal represented conspiracy by generals and politicians who believed Washington's leadership was inadequate and that different commander could achieve victories that eluded current general. Thomas Conway and Horatio Gates led effort to undermine Washington's authority, pointing to defeats at Brandywine and Germantown, while ignoring circumstances that made those battles nearly unwinnable, regardless of commander's skill. The army's loyalty was tested as conspirators attempted to convince officers and soldiers that Washington should be replaced by commander who could win decisive victories and improve conditions that made Valley Forge unbearable. But soldiers recognized that their suffering resulted from congressional failures rather than Washington's leadership, understanding that no general could fight effectively without supplies and support that Congress failed to provide consistently. Washington's moral authority was affirmed when conspiracy collapsed due to lack of support from officers who valued his integrity and shared sacrifice more than they desired victory under leader who might abandon them when circumstances became difficult. The failed plot strengthened Washington's position by demonstrating that Army's loyalty was personal rather than merely institutional, based on respect earned through years of shared hardship rather than on formal command authority alone. The politics of betrayal revealed that revolution's success depended partly on personal relationships and character as much as military strategy and political maneuvering, that soldiers would follow leaders they trusted through impossible circumstances, while rejecting technically superior commanders who lacked integrity and commitment to their welfare that Washington demonstrated despite his strategic and tactical limitations. Disease claimed more soldiers than bullets ever had. Smallpox, typhus, and dysentery swept through Valley Forge with devastating efficiency, exploiting crowded, unsanitary conditions and weakened immune systems to kill thousands of soldiers who survived British combat, only to die from infections that proper hygiene and nutrition might have prevented. The camp became massive hospital, where more men lay sick than stood ready for duty, threatening Army's effectiveness, even if soldiers survived winter physically intact. Doctors were overwhelmed by scale of medical crisis, lacking medicine, surgical equipment, and basic supplies necessary to treat patients whose numbers exceeded any reasonable capacity to provide adequate care. Medical knowledge of era was insufficient to prevent or cure most diseases afflicting soldiers, making doctors largely helpless witnesses to suffering they could not alleviate through treatments that often did more harm than good. Soldiers buried comrades in frozen graves that had to be hacked from ground too hard for easy digging, conducting makeshift funeral services for men who had survived years of war only to die from preventable diseases in camp that should have been refuge, but became death trap. The steady stream of burials demoralized survivors who wondered whether disease would claim them next, despite their survival of multiple battles and campaigns. The shadow of death hung over Valley Forge as omnipresent threat that affected every aspect of daily life, making simple survival the primary concern, while military training and discipline became secondary to basic existence. The psychological impact of watching comrades die from disease was perhaps worse than combat deaths, lacking heroism or purpose that might have made sacrifice meaningful and leaving only senseless waste of lives lost to preventable causes. Behind every soldier stood someone who refused to let them die. Camp followers, wives, nurses, and cooks sustained Army's survival through work that received no recognition or compensation, but without which Army would have collapsed completely. These women maintained what passed for sanitation, prepared what food existed, nursed sick soldiers with tenderness that overworked doctors could not provide, and generally preserved human dignity in conditions designed to destroy it. The women of Valley Forge demonstrated endurance and courage in silence and anonymity, their contributions invisible in official records, but essential to Army's survival through winter that would have killed more soldiers without their presence. They shared soldiers' privations while performing labor that exhausted healthy women and that they sustained despite malnutrition and exposure to diseases that killed many who came to help others. Their work included washing infected clothing despite risk of contracting diseases themselves, preparing meals from inadequate ingredients through skill and determination that stretched meager supplies, and providing emotional support to men whose spirits were breaking under accumulated weight of suffering and deprivation. The psychological impact of their presence exceeded their practical contributions, reminding soldiers that they were valued and cared for, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. History largely forgot these women whose names went unrecorded and whose sacrifices received no monuments, but their contribution to revolution's survival was as essential as any general's strategy or politician's diplomacy. They embodied revolution's dependence on ordinary people's extraordinary commitment to cause that required sacrifices from everyone, regardless of whether formal histories would remember their names or acknowledge their essential roles in achieving independence. The worst had passed, but no one knew it yet. Gradual stabilization occurred through February 1778, as completed huts provided better shelter. Small food convoys began arriving with greater regularity, and soldiers adapted to conditions that would have killed them earlier, but that they learned to endure through physical and psychological adjustments. The improvements were modest but significant, reducing death rate and allowing army to begin functioning as military organization rather than mere survival operation. Morale flickered back slowly, as soldiers recognized they had survived worst of winter and that spring would eventually come with renewed campaigning opportunities. The beginning of endurance emerged not as hope, but as grim determination to continue despite suffering, understanding that having come this far made surrender or desertion seem like betrayal of comrades who had died and of cause that had demanded so much. The turning point in silence was unnoticed at time, because changes were incremental rather than dramatic, improvements measured in slightly better food supply or marginally fewer deaths, rather than in obvious transformation that would have been visible to contemporary observers. Only retrospectively could historians identify February as moment when Valley Forge's crisis began easing and Army's survival became probable rather than uncertain. Yet, something fundamental had shifted. Even if soldiers could not articulate what had changed, they had endured what seemed unendurable and had not broken, proving to themselves that revolution commanded loyalty deep enough to sustain extraordinary sacrifice. This psychological transformation mattered as much as physical improvements, creating foundation for military effectiveness that would emerge fully only after additional training and reorganization occurred. He came from across the ocean and changed everything. Baron von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge in February 1778, with credentials claiming extensive experience in Frederick the Great's Prussian army, though his actual rank and service were embellished to impress American officials. His flamboyant personality and broken English made unlikely figure for military reformer, but his genuine expertise in training and his passionate commitment to American cause made him exactly what Continental Army needed at moment of greatest weakness. The Prussian officer's arrival represented turning point, as Washington recognized that von Steuben possessed skills Continental Army desperately needed, systematic training methods that could transform undisciplined militia style, force into professional army capable of fighting British regulars on equal terms. Von Steuben's immense skill in drill and tactics combined with absolute commitment to discipline to create training program that revolutionized Continental Army's effectiveness in remarkably short time. Von Steuben's personality was as important as his technical expertise, his theatrical style and passionate outbursts, entertaining soldiers while commanding their respect through visible competence and genuine concern for their welfare. He learned English military commands and cursed fluently in multiple languages when soldiers performed poorly, creating training environment that was demanding but fair, and that soldiers responded to enthusiastically despite harsh conditions. The arrival of stranger who became America's unlikely savior demonstrated revolution's ability to attract international support from individuals motivated by idealism or adventure to risk their lives for cause they believed, transcended national boundaries. Von Steuben's contribution would prove decisive in transforming Continental Army from desperate survivors into effective military force capable of winning war that had seemed lost during Valley Forge's darkest months. He taught an army of farmers to fight like soldiers. Von Steuben's training reforms began immediately, despite winter conditions, focusing on basic military skills that Continental soldiers lacked: proper marching in formation, coordinated musket drill that maximized firing efficiency, and battlefield coordination that allowed units to maneuver under fire without dissolving into chaos. His systematic approach to training replaced haphazard methods that different units had employed previously, creating standardized procedures that allowed Continental Army to function as unified force. The drillmaster personally trained model company that would demonstrate proper techniques to entire army, working directly with soldiers rather than delegating to subordinates in departure from European practice that separated aristocratic officers from common soldiers. His hands-on approach won soldiers' respect and allowed him to understand their capabilities and limitations in ways that informed realistic training program adapted to American circumstances rather than merely transplanting. Prussian methods. Musket discipline and battlefield coordination improved dramatically as soldiers learned to load and fire in coordinated volleys that multiplied their effectiveness, to march in formation that allowed tactical flexibility, and to execute maneuvers under simulated combat stress that prepared them for actual battles. The transformation of chaos into order was visible within weeks as ragged survivors of Valley Forge's early months began performing drill movements with precision that impressed observers and boosted soldiers' confidence. Von Steuben's training created Continental Army capable of facing British regulars without automatic disadvantage that previous encounters had revealed, giving American forces foundation of professional skills that could be combined with their advantages in motivation and knowledge of terrain to produce military effectiveness that British could no longer dismiss as insignificant. He didn't just train them, he rewrote what it meant to be an army. Von Steuben's regulations codified training methods into manual that became standard for Continental Army and eventually for United States military long after Revolution ended. The Blue Book provided systematic instructions for drill, camp sanitation, military discipline, and tactical formations that replaced informal practices with professional standards modeled on European military science, but adapted to American circumstances and democratic sensibilities. Discipline, structure, and respect replaced fear and disorder as organizing principles of Continental Army under von Steuben's reforms. He emphasized treating soldiers with respect rather than brutal punishments common in European armies, understanding that volunteer citizen soldiers required different approach than conscripted peasants who served European monarchs. His methods proved that discipline could be maintained through leadership and esprit de corps rather than through terror. From militia to military marked transformation that Valley Forge and von Steuben created amateur force that had sustained revolution through courage and determination, became professional army capable of executing complex operations and matching British regulars in conventional battles. The Continental Army was born at Valley Forge through combination of Survival's Forge and von Steuben's systematic training that created fighting force qualitatively different from the desperate survivors who had arrived in December. The Blue Book's legacy extended far beyond immediate military impact, establishing principles of military professionalism based on respect for soldiers rather than aristocratic contempt that characterized European armies, creating distinctly American military culture that balanced discipline with individual dignity in ways that reflected Revolution's broader ideals about human equality and proper relationship between authority and citizens. He was no longer the man of 1776, nor was his army. Washington emerged from Valley Forge as more effective commander, having learned from defeats and having gained confidence in Continental Army's ability to withstand extraordinary hardship without breaking. His leadership matured through crisis as he developed political skills necessary to manage Congress while maintaining soldiers' loyalty despite conditions that justified mutiny or mass desertion. Washington's renewed leadership reflected his recognition that Army required professional training and systematic organization to compete with British forces, his willingness to accept von Steuben's reforms, demonstrating humility and adaptability that characterized his growth as military commander. The growing unity of his men came from shared suffering that created bonds stronger than formal military hierarchy, transforming Continental Army into cohesive force bound by mutual loyalty and respect. Respect, forged through suffering, created relationship between Washington and soldiers that transcended normal military command, based on recognition that their general had shared their privations and had never abandoned them despite political pressure and personal doubt. Faith restored through example meant soldiers believed Washington would never sacrifice them needlessly and would always attempt to provide what army needed, even when circumstances made adequate support impossible. Washington, reborn from Valley Forge, was commander, whose army trusted him completely, whose political skills had improved through necessity, and whose strategic understanding had deepened through reflection on defeats and near catastrophe that winter had brought. He and his army emerged from Valley Forge fundamentally changed, ready to fight war with professional competence and psychological resilience that British could not overcome through superior resources alone. A new flag rose, not in battle, but in alliance. France's formal entry into war following Saratoga victory reached Valley Forge in spring 1778, bringing hope that sustained international support would provide resources and naval power necessary to defeat British Empire that Continental Army alone could never overcome. The news surged through camp with electrifying effect, suggesting that survival through Valley Forge's hell had not been pointless and that revolution now possessed realistic chance of achieving independence. French alliance transformed strategic situation by making American Revolution part of global conflict that would strain British resources and prevent them from concentrating overwhelming force against Continental Army. The promise of French military and naval support, money, and diplomatic recognition gave revolution legitimacy and resources that isolated colonial rebellion could never possess, making independence achievable goal rather than desperate dream. Hope transformed Valley Forge from site of despair into symbol of determination, as soldiers recognized that their suffering had bought time necessary for international situation to shift in America's favor. The psychological impact exceeded immediate practical benefits, as soldiers gained confidence that independence was achievable and that their sacrifices would be vindicated through eventual victory rather than wasted in failed rebellion. Valley Forge turned from despair to determination as spring approached, and as news from Europe, combined with von Steuben's training reforms, to suggest that Continental Army would emerge from winter capable of fighting effectively, supported adequately to sustain military resistance until British accepted American independence as unavoidable political reality. They came in broken, they marched out as soldiers. June 1778 marked Continental Army's departure from Valley Forge to resume campaigning against British forces, evacuating Philadelphia to consolidate in New York. The army that marched out bore little resemblance to desperate survivors who had arrived 6 months earlier, transformed through survival and training into professional military force capable of matching British regulars in conventional battle. A line of disciplined men, muskets gleaming and drums rolling, represented visual proof of Valley Forge's transformation, as observers watched Continental soldiers march in proper formation with precision that demonstrated von Steuben's training effectiveness. The contrast with ragged ghost army that had entered Valley Forge could not have been more dramatic, suggesting that winter's suffering had forged army capable of winning independence that had seemed impossible during dark months. The march out symbolized rebirth from ashes, as army literally rose from near-death experience to demonstrate vitality and competence that shocked British observers, expecting continued continental weakness. Soldiers carried themselves with confidence, born from knowledge that they had survived worst conditions imaginable and had emerged stronger rather than broken, ready to prove Valley Forge's lessons in combat against enemy who had underestimated their resilience. Reborn army marching from Valley Forge represented revolution's triumph over adversity through human endurance and systematic reform. Combining survival's psychological strength with professional military training to create force qualitatively superior to any Continental Army had previously fielded and capable of achieving victories that would eventually force British to accept American independence. Under the summer sun, they proved what winter had made them. The Battle of Monmouth on June 28, 1778, tested Continental Army's reforms as Washington's forces fought British regulars commanded by General Clinton in prolonged engagement that demonstrated American military competence. The battle was tactical draw, but strategic victory, as Continental forces stood their ground against British assaults and executed complex maneuvers under fire without collapsing into chaos that had characterized earlier battles. Washington's reformed army fought British on equal terms for first time in war, maintaining formations and coordinating attacks with efficiency that surprised British commanders expecting easy victory over colonial amateurs. Von Steuben's training proved its worth, as Continental soldiers executed tactical movements that required discipline and coordination previously beyond their capabilities, demonstrating that Valley Forge's suffering had produced army capable of professional military operations. The ultimate vindication of Valley Forge's suffering came as soldiers proved they could fight effectively, despite heat exhaustion and physical stress that approached winter's privations in different form. Their performance demonstrated that transformation was complete and permanent, rather than temporary improvement that would disappear under combat pressure, establishing Continental Army as legitimate military force, deserving respect, rather than contempt from professional soldiers. Monmouth tested and validated everything Valley Forge had created: endurance, training, unity, and confidence that combined to produce military effectiveness that made American independence achievable through military victory, rather than merely through British exhaustion or political compromise that might have preserved some British authority over colonies that had declared complete separation. They endured the winter that saved the Revolution. Valley Forge entered American memory as symbol of sacrifice and perseverance that made independence possible through survival that defied reason and through transformation that created army capable of winning war. The encampment's legacy transcends its military significance to represent broader truth about how nations are born through suffering that tests whether cause commands loyalty deep enough to sustain extraordinary sacrifice. Reflection on Valley Forge reveals that leadership, endurance, and systematic reform combined to save revolution from collapse that seemed inevitable during winter's darkest months. Washington's moral authority, soldiers' loyalty, von Steuben's training, and eventual French alliance created conditions for survival and eventual victory that none could have achieved separately, but that together produced transformation essential to winning independence. The rebirth of cause through pain demonstrated that military success requires more than strategy and resources. It demands human commitment that survives despite suffering and that transforms adversity into strength through shared experience that binds individuals into unified force. Valley Forge proved that cause deserving independence possessed support deep enough to sustain army through conditions that justified surrender by any reasonable standard. Valley Forge was not site of victory, but where victory became possible through survival that established Continental Army's credibility and through reforms that created military effectiveness necessary to defeat British forces. The winter's suffering was not purposeless, but essential forge, where revolution's fate was decided not through battle but through test of whether cause commanded loyalty adequate to its extraordinary demands, and whether leadership could transform desperate survivors into professional soldiers capable of winning independence through military achievement. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.